I gave my greedy heirs exactly what they wanted. 30 seconds later, their lawyer stopped reading, adjusted his glasses, and went completely silent. The room that had been buzzing with confidence suddenly felt smaller. No one knew what was written on the final page except me. And when Robert Hayes finally looked up from the document, even my son seemed to realize something had gone terribly wrong. But to understand how we got there, you need to go back 2 weeks. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I am 72 years old, a widow, a mother, and until recently, I believed family meant something more than paperwork and property. My husband George and I spent 46 years building a life together. We raised our son Daniel in a modest home outside Columbus, Ohio. We worked hard, saved carefully, and never lived beyond our means. George owned a small manufacturing company. I handled the books. Every dollar we earned came from years of early mornings and late nights. We were never flashy people. We simply believed in building something that would last. When George passed away, the silence inside the house became its own kind of companion. His coffee mug stayed on the kitchen shelf. His favorite chair remained beside the fireplace. Some mornings I would still glance toward the driveway, expecting to see his pickup truck pulling in. Grief has a strange way of making time stand still while the rest of the world keeps moving. At first, Daniel seemed supportive. He called often. He visited on weekends. Ashley, my daughter-in-law, brought casseroles and offered polite smiles. I remember feeling grateful. I thought we would get through the loss together. Looking back now, I realized the change started much sooner than I noticed. Small things. Ashley asking questions about property taxes. Daniel wondering whether I planned to keep the house forever. Casual conversations about estate planning. Questions that seemed reasonable at the time. After all, people talk about practical matters after a death. Or at least that is what I told myself. Then the visits became less about me and more about what I owned. Ashley would walk through rooms commenting on renovations she would make. Daniel would discuss market values and investment opportunities. They spoke about the future as though I were no longer part of it. One Saturday afternoon, I overheard something I was never meant to hear. They were standing on my back porch while I was inside making coffee. The kitchen window was cracked open. Their voices drifted in with the summer air. "Once everything is transferred, we can sell this place for a fortune," Ashley said. Daniel laughed softly. "Just be patient. It won't take much longer." I stood frozen beside the sink. At first, I convinced myself I had misunderstood. Surely they couldn't be talking about my home. Surely my own son wouldn't discuss my future as if I were an obstacle standing between him and a payday. Yet over the next several days, the signs became impossible to ignore. Ashley called a real estate agent. Daniel requested copies of financial documents he had never cared about before. They weren't asking if I needed help. They were measuring what would belong to them someday. The worst part wasn't the greed. It was the certainty. They behaved like people who had already won. One evening, Daniel sat across from me at the dining room table and said something I will never forget. "Mom, you should start thinking about simplifying your life." Simplifying. Such a harmless word. Yet something in his voice felt rehearsed. Ashley nodded beside him. "You deserve less stress at your age." Less stress. More empty phrases. More smiles that never reached their eyes. I looked around the room where George and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and Christmas mornings. Every photograph on the wall represented decades of memories. Yet somehow they only saw square footage and market value. I smiled politely. I agreed with everything they suggested. I thanked them for their concern. And from that moment forward, they believed I was exactly what they wanted me to be. Vulnerable, lonely, easy to influence. They had no idea I was paying attention. They had no idea George had left behind something neither of them knew existed. Most importantly, they had no idea that in exactly 14 days, they would sit in a lawyer's office believing they had finally secured their inheritance. And they had no idea that I intended to give them exactly what they wanted. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, just as I had for most of my adult life. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. George used to joke that the clock was more reliable than any person he had ever met. Standing alone in the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee and stared through the window at the backyard we had spent decades caring for together. The maple tree near the fence had grown tall enough to shade half the lawn now. George planted it when Daniel was 10 years old. Looking at it brought back memories of birthday parties, summer cookouts, and afternoons when family seemed simple. Back then, I believed hard work and love were enough to keep people together. Lately, I was not so sure. Over the following days, I paid closer attention than I ever had before. I listened more than I spoke. It is remarkable what people reveal when they believe you are no longer paying attention. Daniel and Ashley visited twice that week. They arrived carrying smiles and concern, but beneath every conversation was the same destination: money, property, ownership. During one visit, Ashley wandered through the living room while I prepared lunch. I heard her commenting on the hardwood floors. She talked about paint colors. She discussed removing some of the furniture, not preserving it, not respecting it, removing it. Every sentence sounded less like a guest visiting a relative and more like someone planning a renovation. Daniel sat at the dining room table reviewing documents on his tablet. He barely looked up when I brought sandwiches. Years ago, he would have asked about my day. He would have stayed for coffee. Now his attention drifted toward numbers and valuations. At one point, he casually mentioned that home prices in the area had increased nearly 30% over the last few years. He said it the same way someone might discuss the weather. I nodded and said nothing. The less I reacted, the more comfortable they became. That was when the truth started slipping through the cracks. One afternoon, Ashley received a phone call while standing in my front hallway. She stepped outside to answer it, but the screen door remained partially open. Her voice carried inside. I was not trying to eavesdrop. I was watering a plant near the entryway when I heard her say, "We are almost there. Once everything is finalized, we can move forward." There was a pause. Then she laughed softly. "Trust me, she is not going to fight it. She, not Margaret, not Mom. She." The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. That evening, I sat alone in George's chair. It was something I rarely did. The leather had worn smooth over the years. I could almost imagine him sitting beside me. For a long time, I stared at the framed photograph on the mantel. It had been taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. We looked tired, happy, and proud of the life we had built. George always had a way of noticing things before anyone else. He trusted people, but he was never naive. As the room darkened around me, I remembered a conversation we had shared several years earlier. Daniel and Ashley had just left after a holiday dinner. George stood at the window watching their car disappear down the street. "Promise me something," he said. I laughed and asked what could possibly sound so serious after pumpkin pie. He did not laugh back. "If people ever start treating you like an asset instead of a person, pay attention." At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now those words felt different. They felt like a warning. 2 days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. I received a call from an unfamiliar number. The woman introduced herself as a representative from a senior living community nearly 40 miles away. She politely thanked me for my recent inquiry and offered to schedule a tour. I told her there must be some mistake. I had never contacted her organization. The woman apologized and confirmed the information submitted included my name, address, and phone number. After ending the call, I sat perfectly still at the kitchen table. Someone had been making plans for my future. Plans I knew nothing about. Plans I had never approved. And for the first time, I realized just how far Daniel and Ashley were willing to go if it meant getting what they wanted. For the rest of that day, I could not focus on anything else. The phone call from the senior living community replayed in my mind over and over. Someone had filled out forms using my personal information. Someone had begun building a future for me without ever speaking to me about it. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted to believe my son would never participate in something like that. But every new detail seemed to point in the same direction. That evening, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. He asked how I was feeling. He asked whether I needed groceries. He even offered to stop by the next day. 10 years earlier, that call would have warmed my heart. Now it felt different. Every word sounded rehearsed, as though he were checking boxes on a list. I thanked him and accepted the visit. If they wanted me to believe everything was normal, I was willing to play along. The next afternoon, Daniel and Ashley arrived carrying takeout containers from my favorite restaurant. Ashley hugged me at the door. Daniel smiled more than usual. Their kindness felt strangely timed. We sat around the kitchen table, eating lunch and talking about ordinary things. The weather, traffic, a new grocery store opening across town. Then Ashley carefully steered the conversation exactly where she wanted it to go. She mentioned retirement communities. Not directly at first. She talked about a friend's mother who had recently moved into one. She described the activities, the social events, and the convenience. Daniel nodded along. A lot of people are choosing that lifestyle now, he said. Less maintenance. Less responsibility. I stirred my iced tea and listened. Ashley leaned forward slightly. Have you ever thought about downsizing? The question hung in the air. I smiled politely. Not really. She exchanged a quick glance with Daniel. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. Well, she said, it is something to consider. The conversation moved on, but the message remained. They were testing the waters, measuring my resistance, looking for an opening. After lunch, Daniel volunteered to take out the trash. As he stepped outside, Ashley excused herself to use the restroom. A few moments later, I realized she had gone upstairs instead. Quietly, I followed. I stopped halfway up the staircase when I heard a drawer sliding open in my bedroom. Then another. Ashley emerged several minutes later, looking perfectly calm. She nearly jumped when she saw me standing in the hallway. Oh, she said, pressing a hand against her chest. You startled me. I looked toward the bedroom. Did you need something? Her smile appeared instantly. I was looking for the bathroom and got turned around. It was a poor excuse. She had visited my house for nearly 20 years. She knew exactly where the bathroom was. Yet I simply nodded and let it go. The less I challenged them, the more careless they became. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. A certified letter was delivered to my mailbox. Inside was a packet from a financial advisory firm. The documents referenced an appointment request regarding estate transition planning. My estate, my information, my assets. The request form listed Daniel as a contact person. I sat at the dining room table reading every page twice. Then I folded the papers neatly and placed them inside a drawer. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. They were not waiting for an inheritance someday. They were actively preparing to take control of everything as soon as possible. That night, I walked into George's study for the first time in months. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar wood. His desk remained exactly as he left it. For several minutes, I stood there in silence. Then I opened the bottom drawer. Tucked behind a row of files was a sealed envelope with my name written in George's familiar handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up. I had seen the envelope before, but I had never opened it. George told me it was important. He told me I would know when the time was right. Sitting alone in his study, with the house quiet around me, I realized that moment had finally arrived. For several moments, I simply sat there holding the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, and George's handwriting brought an unexpected ache to my chest. He had always written carefully, every letter neat and deliberate. Seeing my name on the front felt like hearing his voice again after months of silence. Outside the study window, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the backyard. Everything looked calm, ordinary, yet I had the strange feeling that my life was about to change. Slowly, I broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The first page was a letter addressed to me. As I began reading, it felt as though George were sitting across the desk speaking directly to me. He wrote that if I was reading the letter, circumstances had unfolded exactly as he feared they might. He explained that success often reveals people's true character. According to George, kindness is easy when nothing is at stake. The real test comes when money, property, and opportunity enter the picture. He told me not to be angry. He told me not to act impulsively. Most importantly, he told me to watch carefully and let people reveal themselves completely before making any decisions. I read every word twice. Then I moved on to the remaining documents. There were legal papers, financial records, instructions. Several pages referenced Robert Heirs, our longtime attorney. George had prepared everything years earlier. The more I read, the more I understood that he had anticipated possibilities I never wanted to imagine. He had built protections into the estate, not because he distrusted family, but because he understood human nature. By the time I reached the final page, my hands had stopped trembling. For the first time in weeks, the confusion began to clear. Suddenly, the strange conversations, the unexpected phone calls, and the growing pressure all made sense. More importantly, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. The following morning, I called Robert Heirs. He answered on the second ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still steady and professional. When I told him I had finally opened George's envelope, there was a long pause. Then he quietly said, I wondered when that day would come. We arranged to meet that afternoon. Robert's office occupied the third floor of a brick building downtown, the same building where George and I had signed countless business documents over the years. Walking into the reception area felt strangely familiar. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me to Robert's office. When he entered, he shook my hand and studied my face carefully. "You read everything?" he asked. I nodded. "Every word." He leaned back in his chair. "Then you understand why George created those provisions." I looked out the window, overlooking the city streets below. "I understand more than I wish I did." For nearly 2 hours, Robert explained details I had never fully appreciated before. George had not merely left instructions. He had left a framework. Certain actions, certain behaviors, and certain attempts to influence estate decisions carried consequences. Everything had been documented properly and reviewed multiple times over the years. Nothing had been left to chance. When our meeting ended, Robert handed me a folder. "You do not need to decide anything today," he said. "But whatever you choose, make sure it is based on facts, not emotions." Driving home, I thought about those words. Facts, not emotions. The truth was that my emotions had already been through every stage imaginable. Sadness, disappointment, denial, hurt. But now something else was replacing them. Clarity. That evening, Daniel called again. He asked if I wanted company for dinner. His tone sounded especially cheerful. I accepted immediately. If George's letter had taught me anything, it was that people eventually reveal themselves when they believe they are close to getting what they want. And for the first time since all of this began, I was ready to let them think they were winning. Daniel and Ashley arrived just after 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of sparkling cider and a bakery pie. From the outside, they looked like the picture of a caring son and daughter-in-law. Ashley complimented the flowers on my front porch. Daniel offered to help set the table. If a stranger had walked into my kitchen that evening, they would have seen a loving family sharing dinner together. What they would not have seen was the calculation hiding beneath every polite smile. Throughout the meal, I followed Robert's advice. I watched. I listened. I paid attention to facts instead of emotions. The more I observed, the more obvious everything became. Daniel asked questions about maintenance costs on the house. Ashley wanted to know whether I had updated any insurance policies recently. At one point, she casually asked where I kept important documents. The question arrived so smoothly that someone else might have missed it entirely. I simply smiled and changed the subject. They never noticed. A few days later, I decided to give them exactly what they seemed to want. During a Sunday visit, I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the responsibilities that came with managing the estate. The effect was immediate. Ashley's eyes brightened before she could hide it. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. I told them I had been thinking about simplifying things, selling certain assets, organizing paperwork, preparing for the future. Every word seemed to encourage them. Every sentence lowered their guard. For the first time in months, they looked genuinely excited to spend time with me. Over the following week, their behavior changed dramatically. They called more often. They offered help with errands. Ashley even brought over homemade soup one afternoon. Years earlier, I would have interpreted these gestures as kindness. Now I recognized them as investments. They believed a reward was coming. The most revealing moment happened on a Thursday afternoon. Ashley thought I was outside gardening. Instead, I had returned through the garage after putting away a bag of potting soil. As I stepped into the laundry room, I heard voices coming from the kitchen. Daniel and Ashley were talking quietly. "Once the transfer is done, we can refinance and use the equity," Ashley said. "The property alone is worth more than we expected." Daniel laughed softly. "We just need to stay patient a little longer." I stood motionless for several seconds. Not because I was shocked anymore. That feeling had passed. What I felt instead was certainty. They were not worried about my well-being. They were already spending money they did not own. Later that evening, I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. The air was warm. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. In moments like that, George always knew exactly what to say. I found myself wishing he were there beside me. Yet strangely, I also felt closer to him than I had in months. His letter had removed the fog from my thinking. His planning had given me time. Most importantly, it had given me perspective. The next morning, Robert called. He informed me that everything was ready. The necessary documents had been reviewed. The meeting could take place whenever I chose. I looked across the living room at the family photographs lining the shelves. Decades of birthdays, graduations, vacations, and holidays stared back at me. Some memories still hurt. Others made me smile. But all of them reminded me of a simple truth. Family is not defined by what people inherit. Family is revealed by how they treat you when they think they have nothing left to gain. I thanked Robert and agreed to schedule the meeting. By the time I hung up the phone, the date was set. In less than 1 week, everyone would gather in the same room believing their future had finally arrived. None of them realized that the most important part of George's plan had not even been revealed yet. The days leading up to the meeting passed with surprising calm. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Daniel called almost every evening. Ashley checked in regularly. They asked how I was feeling. They offered assistance with appointments, errands, and paperwork. To anyone looking from the outside, it would have seemed like a devoted family gathering around a widowed mother. Yet once you know what to look for, certain things become impossible to ignore. Their kindness always seemed to circle back to the same topics. The house, the estate, the future. One afternoon, Ashley stopped by with coffee and pastries from a local bakery. We sat in the sunroom overlooking the backyard. She complimented the neighborhood and talked about how much families loved living in this area. Then she casually mentioned that property values had increased again. I smiled and listened. She spoke as though she were discussing general market trends. But I could see the excitement behind her eyes. She was not thinking about the market. She was thinking about ownership. Later that week, Daniel offered to help organize some files in my study. For years, he had shown little interest in paperwork. Suddenly, he wanted to know where records were stored and whether everything had been updated recently. I thanked him and said I had already handled it. He seemed disappointed for only a second before recovering with a polite smile. Small moments like that told me more than any direct confession ever could. The closer we got to the meeting date, the more confident they became. One evening, they invited me to dinner at their home. Ashley prepared an elaborate meal. Daniel opened a bottle of sparkling cider and proposed a toast to family. As everyone raised their glasses, I noticed something unusual. They were celebrating before anything had actually happened. There was a sense of anticipation hanging over the table, as though they believed a major victory was only days away. At one point, Ashley began discussing renovation ideas she had seen online. A larger kitchen, updated flooring, expanded windows facing the backyard. She caught herself midway through the conversation and quickly changed the subject, but the slip had already happened. She was describing improvements for a house she did not own. Driving home that night, I found myself thinking about George again. Throughout our marriage, he often said that patience reveals character. Most people can hide their intentions for a while. Very few can hide them when they believe success is within reach. The next morning, I met briefly with Robert Hayes. We reviewed the schedule for the upcoming gathering and confirmed that everything was in order. He remained professional as always, but I noticed a certain seriousness in his expression. He understood exactly what was about to unfold. Before I left, he asked a simple question. "Are you certain you want to proceed?" I thought about it carefully, not because I doubted the decision, but because I understood its consequences. Some truths cannot be unseen once they are revealed. "Yes," I answered. "I am certain." Robert nodded and closed the folder. Then all that remains is to let events take their course. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Not from anxiety. Not from fear. It was something closer to reflection. I walked through the house room by room. The kitchen where Daniel did homework as a child. The living room where George and I celebrated anniversaries. The hallway lined with family photographs. Every corner held memories. Some joyful, some painful, all of them real. Near midnight, I stopped in front of George's photograph on the mantel. For a long moment, I simply stood there. Then I smiled. The waiting was almost over. By this time tomorrow, everyone would finally learn that not every inheritance is measured in dollars, and not every plan ends the way people expect. The morning of the meeting arrived gray and cool. A light drizzle covered the streets as I drove downtown toward Robert Hayes' office. Traffic moved slowly, but I was in no hurry. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not because I knew exactly what would happen, but because uncertainty was finally coming to an end. When I arrived, Robert's receptionist greeted me and escorted me to the conference room. The long polished table looked exactly as I remembered. Large windows overlooked the city. Legal folders were neatly arranged at each seat. Everything felt orderly, professional, and quiet. I took my place near the end of the table and waited. Daniel and Ashley arrived 15 minutes later. They entered carrying the confidence of people who believed the future belonged to them. Ashley wore a tailored navy jacket and carried a leather portfolio. Daniel smiled warmly as he greeted me. He even placed a hand on my shoulder and asked how I was feeling. I smiled back and told him I was doing well. Across the table, Ashley glanced around the room with obvious interest. Her eyes paused on the folders, then on the attorney's chair, then on the large window overlooking downtown. She looked less like a family member attending an estate meeting and more like someone preparing for an important business transaction. A few minutes later, 2 additional relatives arrived. George's nephew Michael and his wife Karen had also been invited. They exchanged polite greetings before taking their seats. Everyone spoke quietly while waiting for Robert. The atmosphere felt almost festive. There was an energy in the room that reminded me of people gathering before a major announcement. Every smile seemed slightly wider than normal. Every conversation felt slightly forced. Then Robert entered carrying a thick file. The room immediately grew silent. He greeted everyone, took his seat, and carefully organized the documents in front of him. For several moments, no one spoke. The only sound came from the rain tapping softly against the windows. Robert finally looked up. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "Today we will review the final estate instructions left by George Sullivan." Ashley sat a little straighter. Daniel folded his hands together. Robert began with routine matters: property records, financial accounts, business interests, tax documentation. The information was detailed but predictable. Several times I noticed Ashley exchanging small glances with Daniel. Each time, they seemed increasingly pleased. As the meeting continued, certain assets were discussed. Others were summarized. Everything appeared to be moving exactly as they expected. The confidence around the table grew stronger with every passing minute. At one point, Ashley actually smiled before Robert had finished reading a section. She quickly lowered her eyes when she realized others might have noticed. Daniel appeared equally optimistic. He nodded along as various figures and valuations were reviewed. Neither of them seemed concerned about anything. In fact, they looked relieved. After nearly an hour, Robert paused and took a sip of water. Then he opened a separate folder. Unlike the others, this one contained only a handful of pages. Something about the change caught my attention immediately. Robert adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. The expression on his face became more serious. "The remaining instructions," he said, "were added personally by George Sullivan and reviewed multiple times over the years." The atmosphere shifted ever so slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Ashley crossed one leg over the other and folded her arms confidently. Neither appeared concerned. Why would they be? Up to that point, everything had unfolded exactly the way they expected. Robert lowered his eyes toward the page in front of him. The room became completely still. Outside, the rain continued falling against the glass. Inside, every person waited for him to continue. And then he began reading the final section George had prepared years before. Robert's voice remained steady as he read the opening lines of the final section. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The language was formal, precise, the kind of wording you would expect in any carefully prepared estate document. Daniel appeared relaxed. Ashley sat comfortably in her chair, her expression calm and confident. Across the table, Michael and Karen listened quietly. No one seemed concerned. Then Robert reached the first special provision George had included. He paused briefly before continuing. "My wife, Margaret Sullivan, shall retain complete authority over all estate assets during her lifetime." Ashley's smile faded slightly. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. Daniel shifted in his chair but remained silent. Robert continued reading. The next paragraph described George's belief that families should be built on trust, respect, and genuine care rather than financial expectation. Again, nothing dramatic happened. Yet the atmosphere in the room began to change. The confidence that had filled the space earlier seemed less certain now. Then Robert reached the section I had read dozens of times over the previous week. He lowered the page slightly and adjusted his glasses. For the first time that morning, he looked directly at Daniel and Ashley before returning his attention to the document. "Any beneficiary who attempts to pressure, manipulate, isolate, influence, or improperly direct decisions regarding Margaret Sullivan's residence, finances, healthcare choices, or estate planning shall immediately forfeit all inheritance rights otherwise granted under this estate." The room became completely silent. Daniel's expression froze. Ashley blinked twice as though she had misheard the words. Robert continued. Evidence supporting such actions may include documented communications, witness testimony, written records, financial inquiries made without authorization, attempts to relocate Margaret Sullivan without consent, or efforts to obtain estate control prior to her voluntary decision. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the rain outside seemed quieter. Daniel finally leaned forward. What exactly does that mean? Robert calmly turned another page. It means your father anticipated this possibility many years ago. Ashley forced a small laugh. Surely that clause would require proof. Robert looked at her for a moment. Then he opened a separate folder. The color drained from her face almost immediately. Inside were copies of records, correspondence, notes, and documentation collected over several years. George had not simply created the provision. He had also established a process for evaluating conduct if concerns ever arose. Robert's expression remained professional. The review was completed according to the instructions left by George Sullivan. Daniel looked from Robert to me and back again. For the first time all morning, he appeared genuinely unsettled. Ashley's confidence had disappeared entirely. Her arms unfolded. Her posture changed. She no longer looked like someone attending a victory celebration. She looked like someone realizing the rules of the game were very different from what she had imagined. Robert continued reading. Each sentence seemed heavier than the last. The findings referenced attempts to discuss property transfers before authorization, repeated inquiries regarding estate control, communications concerning future use of assets before ownership existed, conversations about relocating me without my request. The evidence had been reviewed exactly as George instructed. No arguments. No emotional debates. Just facts. By the time Robert reached the final page, nobody around the table was smiling anymore. Daniel stared at the documents in front of him. Ashley sat completely still. Michael and Karen looked stunned. Then Robert stopped reading. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. The silence stretched across the room. Finally, he looked down at the last sentence George had written years earlier. And when Robert quietly read those final words, every remaining assumption about the inheritance vanished in an instant. The final sentence was shorter than anyone expected. There were no complicated legal terms. No dramatic language. Just a simple instruction written by a man who understood people better than most. Robert cleared his throat and read it aloud. Any beneficiary found to have violated these provisions shall receive $1 and no further claim upon the estate. Nobody spoke. For a moment, it felt as though the entire room had stopped breathing. Daniel stared at Robert, then at me, then back at the document. Ashley's face had gone completely pale. The confidence she carried into that conference room had vanished. The future she had imagined was disappearing line by line. Robert calmly placed the final page on the table. Based upon the review process established by George Sullivan and the documentation provided, these provisions have been activated. Daniel finally found his voice. There has to be some mistake. Robert shook his head. There is no mistake. Ashley leaned forward. You cannot seriously expect us to believe this. Robert remained composed. Whether you believe it or not does not change the terms of the estate. The room fell silent again. Michael and Karen exchanged stunned glances. They had arrived expecting a routine meeting. Instead, they were witnessing the final chapter of a plan created years before. I sat quietly and watched. Not because I enjoyed what was happening. I did not. Despite everything, Daniel was still my son. Nothing could erase the memories of teaching him to ride a bicycle, helping with school projects, or watching him graduate. But love does not require blindness. And consequences do not disappear simply because they are painful. Daniel turned toward me. Mom, you knew about this? His voice sounded smaller than I had heard in years. I looked at him carefully before answering. Your father wanted people to show their character before making decisions. Ashley immediately responded. We were only trying to help. The words hung awkwardly in the air. Nobody at the table seemed convinced. Not even Daniel. Robert opened another folder and reviewed the final distribution instructions. The majority of the estate would remain under my control for the rest of my life. After that, significant portions would fund educational scholarships, community programs, and several charitable organizations George had quietly supported for decades. Other assets would be distributed according to the remaining provisions. Everything had been arranged with remarkable precision. George had not acted out of anger. He had acted out of principle. That was the part many people never understood. This was never about punishment. It was about accountability. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Papers were signed. Copies were distributed. Chairs moved quietly across the floor as people prepared to leave. Daniel lingered near the doorway. For a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say something. Perhaps an apology. Perhaps an explanation. In the end, he simply lowered his eyes. Ashley left without another word. Michael and Karen approached me before departing. Karen gently squeezed my hand. Neither of them needed to say anything. Some moments speak for themselves. A few minutes later, I found myself standing beside Robert near the conference room window. Rain still drifted across the city skyline. George was a remarkable man, Robert said quietly. I smiled. Yes, he was. Robert nodded toward the empty chairs around the table. Most people spend their lives building wealth. Your husband spent his building wisdom. As I walked back to my car, I thought about those words. The rain had nearly stopped. Sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. For the first time in a very long while, the weight I had been carrying felt lighter. The inheritance everyone focused on had never been the house, the accounts, or the investments. The real inheritance was the lesson George left behind. Character matters. Integrity matters. And eventually, every person reveals what they value most. I gave people exactly what they had worked for. The difference was that George had made sure they would also receive the consequences that came with it. Then I started the engine, turned onto the street, and drove home to the life that was still mine.